Getty Ministries presents Living Water. Welcome to Living Water, a Bible study broadcast brought to you by Getty Ministries. I'm your host, Danny Hale, and your speaker again today is Dr. David Lawrence. As we continue our series on the priesthood of Christ today, we turn again to the book of Hebrews, and we change our focus from the one who offers the sacrifice to the nature and effectiveness of the sacrifice itself. This should be a very exciting lesson for us as we consider our standing before God as forgiven people based upon the sacrifice offered for us. Let's join David now as we continue the priesthood of Christ.
In our last study, we looked at the qualifications of our high priest. And I'd like for this time for us to come to the sacrifice itself and just step back and take a look at what the Scriptures are saying about the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And we noticed in the study last time that the writer likes to analyze. He will take a point, and then he will come at that point from the standpoint of what does it mean? What can we learn from this? And we're going to tie all this together later on when we look at why he might be writing what he writes. But for now, the point is we want to look at what this sacrifice is. According to the book of Hebrews, what constitutes the sacrifice of our great high priest, Jesus Christ? And to make this simple, we need to focus on one word that occurs over and over and over again in the text. And that is the word once for all. Once for all. The sacrifice of Jesus Christ is once for all. That is a point that would not be lost upon Hebrew people who were used to a system where sacrifices had to be repeated. And the very fact that sacrifices come to an end is very significant. And it is significant for us today as well. But it becomes more meaningful to us when we understand the background of it all. That's why we spent time going back into the past and looking at the sacrifices. But now listen to some of the verses out of Hebrews 9 and 10 which use this expression. And it is by the time we get down particularly to chapter 9 and 10, although there's quite a bit in chapter 7, but chapter 9 and 10 is where he turns his attention particularly to the sacrifice and begins to analyze this sacrifice. 9:12, he did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. 9:26, then Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world, but now he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. 10:10, and by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. 10:12, but when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. 10:14, because by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. Now that's the governing thought when he comes to discuss the sacrifice of Christ. It's once for all. Now we might ask the question as we look at that material, what is he going to tell us about this once for all sacrifice? First of all, why is it once for all? Why is it that this sacrifice does not have to be repeated? That it brings to an end the whole sacrificial system? Well, the first thing to note is that the high priest who offers this once for all sacrifice personally had no sin. 7:27, unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. The other high priests had to sacrifice for their own sins. He does not have to do this. 5:3, this is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins. Here he speaks of the Aaronic high priests who preceded Jesus. They had to offer sacrifice for their own sins as well as for the sins of the people. 9, 7, and 8. But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still standing. And so the ongoing nature of the Mosaic sacrifices, the Aaronic sacrifices, indicates the fact that the priests themselves had sinned. They had to deal with their own sin. And thus the culmination of God's plan of redemption had not yet occurred. It would have to occur through someone who had no sin. And as long as the sacrifices have to continue, the first tabernacle remains standing. Only the Son, no Aaronic high priest, could live without sin at all. And that is the reason that the writer of Hebrews began his discussion with who is the Son, understanding the nature of the Son, the divinity of the Son. Because no Aaronic high priest could live apart from sin. And so we go again to the passage in Hebrews 4:15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet without sin. Now, the Son's sacrifice is the sacrifice of one without sin. And hence that means that the sacrifice can be complete and doesn't need to be repeated. It is complete because the priest himself is complete. He is complete and the sacrifice is complete. Listen to chapter 7, verse 28. For the law appoints as high priests men who are weak, sinful. But the oath, which came after the law, appointed the Son. Notice he uses the Son here. Appointed the Son. And we think of all that he said about the Son. He's the creator of all things. He is the radiance of God's glory. The oath appoints the Son who has been made perfect forever. Made perfect, of course, through his suffering. Made perfect through his sinless life in fulfilling all righteousness. And so the sacrifice of the Son, without sin, that is perfect, sacrifice perfect, priest who offers sacrifice perfect, they're one and the same, with Jesus, that means the sacrificial system comes to an end. It was awaiting a perfect sacrifice. It was awaiting a perfect high priest. And that happens only with the Son, with Jesus Christ. Now, once we understand that the sacrifices are no longer going to be repeated, they don't have to be repeated. There is no ongoing offering of sacrifice. It's a once and for all sacrifice. We can step back and look at those sacrifices under the Mosaic system, under the Aaronic system, and realize they were insufficient. Not only imperfect, not only offered by sinful, weak high priests, but they were insufficient for the ultimate work of taking away sin. They merely pointed toward that, prefigured it, illustrated the need of it, but they were insufficient to do that. The writer of Hebrews says that if they had been sufficient, then they would have ended. And the very fact that those sacrifices continued year after year not only shows that we have sinful, weak high priests and that the tabernacle still remains standing, but obviously those sacrifices are insufficient. Otherwise, the tabernacle would no longer be standing, and there would no longer be these priests offering yearly sacrifice. We come to Hebrews 9:25 for that point. Nor did he, Christ, enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood not his own. The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. If it could, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshipers would have been cleansed once for all, and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins, because it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. And that last reading from Hebrews 10, 1-4. It's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And had that happened, then the worshipers would have been cleansed once for all. Had that happened, they would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. Had that happened, the sacrificial system would have stopped. Did you ever stop to think how much you can get out of just this one point? And the writer is doing that. He is saying, I'm just looking at one point, that it's a once and for all sacrifice of Jesus, and that causes me to understand that the previous sacrifices were insufficient. The previous sacrifices were imperfect. Those who offered the sacrifices were weak. And when perfection comes, that's the end of it. Now, really, the point of a once and for all sacrifice is the governing thought, is the main thought that he wants to give us when he discusses the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. But let's go just a step further with him. Having explained why it is a once and for all sacrifice, he can also now analyze the sacrifice itself in terms of what it is. We see that it is sufficient, yes, it is complete, it is perfect, it is offered by a perfect high priest, but what is it? It is a sacrifice, he said, that meets our need. Now, in our next study, we're going to examine the effect of that sacrifice in detail. Right now, I want us to just introduce this concept and begin to get familiar with it. That it is a sacrifice that meets our need. Whatever need we have, the sacrifice that our high priest offers meets our need. And for this we go to Hebrews 7:26. Such a high priest meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. We'll look more in detail at that later. But obviously, we need a sacrifice to deal with the penalty and the effect of sin. He already said that if those sacrifices under the law had been sufficient, then the conscience would be cleansed from guilt. Well, it's quite obvious that we would understand from that we have a need of our consciences being cleansed from guilt. So man needs a sacrifice sufficient to deal with the penalty and the effect of sin. And no animal sacrifice could meet our needs. We've already read the verse from Hebrews 10:4, but again, we need to notice this. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Man cannot address those needs himself. And now we're hinting at something that we're going to be looking at later on. And that is why the letter was ever written to begin with. But I think that we all realize, surely, those of us who've studied at all in the field of theology would understand that one of the gravest onsetting dangers to our faith is the idea that we can do it, or that somehow what our efforts are needed in the process. And really, this letter will address those, and we'll look at that in greater detail later. But suffice it to say for now, man cannot address his own needs. He has needs that he can't deal with. And the animal sacrifices did not deal with them. But it takes the perfect sacrifice of Jesus to do that. Now, man not only has the need of dealing with sin, really dealing with sin, but there's also the ongoing need of intercession. And the reason for intercession being a need is the fact that sin continues to be a problem in our lives. And sin is very serious. Now, the penalty and the guilt of sin is dealt with in our justification. But we still sin. God justifies sinners. And so, until we're fully sanctified, we certainly need a high priest who will intercede for us. Just as the high priest did under the law, he offered the sacrifice for the people, but then he interceded for the same people for whom he offered sacrifice. And we need our high priest as our advocate, standing before God at the right hand of God, standing there, pleading our case with his Father every day, because every day we sin. And how refreshing and how encouraging and how wonderful it is to know that every day our high priest is interceding. And there are many passages in Scripture which teach that, but Hebrews 7:24-25 teach it very plainly. Because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. You ever thought about this? Suppose Jesus offered sacrifice that was sufficient to deal with my sin, and he offered this sacrifice to God, and God accepted it. And God, in some other way than by the resurrection, showed that he accepted it. But Jesus died, and that was it. Jesus was not raised from the dead. Jesus died. That was the end. And by not raising Jesus, and by Jesus not continuing to live, you see, we would not have an advocate who would on an ongoing basis intercede for us. And that's the point he's making. The Aaronic priest died. This priest, prefigured by the mysterious eternal priesthood of Melchizedek, this priest lives forever. And he lives to intercede for us. That becomes the purpose of his life, is interceding for his people. At least the purpose that the writer wants us to understand here. And then to go just a little more deeply into it. What is happening with this sacrifice? What happens with this sacrifice? With this sacrifice, he entered the most holy place. Remember the references? The holy place is still standing while the Aaronic priests were offering sacrifice. But this priest entered the most holy place of the greater and more perfect tabernacle, 9:11. When Christ came as high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not man-made. That is to say, not part of this creation. Now, the tabernacle to which the writer of Hebrews refers is not the earthly tabernacle. It is not the one that Moses directed the Israelites to build as God gave him the pattern on Mount Sinai. That is not what he's talking about. That earthly tabernacle was a shadow. It foreshadowed, it looked forward to, it was an illustration of the real tabernacle. But that real tabernacle is in heaven. It's already here, and Jesus entered it into the very presence of God, into the true inner sanctum, into the true Holy of Holies, and there he brought his sacrifice. And certainly, now, there's no longer a need for that physical temple, tabernacle, that simply looked forward to what was going to happen when Jesus entered that most holy place. This, the writer says, is the true tabernacle. And is the tabernacle that men didn't pitch, it's the tabernacle the Lord pitched. Hebrews 8:1 and 2. The point of what we are saying is this. We do have such a high priest. I love what he says, the point of what we're saying. He comes back over and over again to say, now this is what I'm talking about. I want you to see this. This is the point of all of it. The point I'm trying to get across, he says, is we do have now such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle, set up by the Lord, not by man. Skipping down to verse 5, chapter 8. They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. Why was it so important that Moses did everything in exact detail? We say, well, it was because he's supposed to obey God. Of course he's supposed to obey God. But why is it so important? And the thing I love about this book is that the writer digs at the reason for things. He goes behind the scenes, so to speak. He keeps asking the questions, the why questions. Why? Why is it so important that Moses built everything according to a divine pattern and did not deviate? Every cubit had to be just right. Every one of those curtains, everything in the carvings, everything had to be just right. God specified it down to the little tiniest detail. Why? Because it was a pattern of heaven. It was a pattern of reality. And reality had to be depicted accurately. I say, well, heaven physical. I don't know. There's a physical reality that we have to deal with in eternity. I'm glad I'm glad it's there. But this is a pattern of heaven. It's a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. That's what he's saying. And that's why he warned Moses. Sometimes we think, well, we're supposed to follow a pattern. No, this is not for us. This was for one man. This is for Moses. Moses, you follow the pattern, because what you, Moses, are doing is a shadow of heaven. I'm not saying we shouldn't obey God, but I'm saying that the concept of pattern has a specific application here. And so in that way, he entered into that true sanctuary. In that way, he performed the work of the high priest in its ultimate reality. And all that the high priest did under the Aaronic priesthood simply foreshadowed and looked forward to that great event when Jesus goes before God. And then we need to notice also that he offered his sacrifice through the Spirit. And for this we go to 9:14. How much more, then, will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. It is through the Spirit that he did it. The same Spirit who guided Jesus, the same Spirit who enabled him to perform miracles, the same Spirit who led him into the wilderness to be tempted, the same Spirit which was given to Jesus without measure, the same Spirit that guided him through life and enabled him to overcome sin. That same Spirit was with him, and through the power of that Spirit he offered himself unblemished to God, and that same Spirit raised him from the dead, and that same Spirit, and this thrills me, lives within us. Think about that. And please notice also that the sacrifice was offered to God. Now, sacrifices had to be perfect, but certainly this one had to be perfect, considering its importance. And notice it was offered to God, not to the devil. Sometimes this idea we hear that the devil took us ransom, and so you got to please the devil. No, it was offered to God. The passage says that. It was offered to God. He offered himself unblemished to God. And this sacrifice now validates the new covenant. That covenant of grace, that covenant that provides the actual forgiveness of sins. Listen to the reading from Hebrews 9, beginning at verse 15. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. In the case of a will, it is necessary to prove the death of the one who made it, because a will is in force only when somebody has died. It never takes effect while the one who made it is living. This is why even the first covenant was not put into effect without blood. When Moses had proclaimed every commandment of the law to all the people, he took the blood of calves together with water, scarlet wool, and branches of hyssop, and sprinkled the scroll on all the people. He said, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you to keep." In the same way he sprinkled with the blood both the tabernacle and everything used in its ceremonies. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. And so the sprinkling of the blood of Christ validates the new covenant, which provides in full reality the forgiveness of sins. And as we read in this passage, his sacrifice becomes a ransom to set his people free from their sin. He died as a ransom to set them free. When we sinned, there had to be a price paid to God for our release. And it is a sacrifice that does away with sin. Christ would have had to have suffered many times since the creation of the world, but now he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. And to make this more specific, as we go deeper into it, it takes away the sins of many people. Just as man is destined to die, Hebrews 9:27, just as man is destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many people, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. And so his sacrifice that he offered is a sacrifice that bears sin and takes away the sins of many people. Further, it removes the guilt of sin. 10:2, in reference to the old sacrifices, if it could, would they not have stopped being offered, for the worshippers would have been cleansed once for all and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. And his sacrifice purifies the heavenly altar. 9:23, it was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a man-made sanctuary that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. And it is a sacrifice, the writer will say as he continues his analysis in chapter 10, that performs the will of God. Then he said, "Here I am. It is written about me in the scroll. I have come to do your will, O God." First he said, "Sacrifices and offerings, burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor were you pleased with them, although the law required them to be made." Then he said, "Here I am. I have come to do your will." He sets aside the first to establish the second. And what is the will of God? The will of God that he accomplishes is that his people, God's people, be made holy. Listen to 10:10 and 10:14. By that will, we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all, because by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. And having done this, he sits down at the right hand of God, indicating that God had accepted his sacrifice. But when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. The point of what we are saying is this: we do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. And since that time he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool. So, as he is seated at the right hand of God and exalted, we learn that God has not only accepted his sacrifice, but his session, his seating, by God's right hand indicates and secures the fact that eventually the will of God will be done and all of God's enemies will be destroyed. And thus, by providing forgiveness once and for all, he brings the sacrificial system to its end, to its final culmination. So the writer can say in 10:18, "And where these have been forgiven, there is no longer any sacrifice for sin." And in 10:26, if we deliberately keep on sinning after we have received the knowledge of the truth, no sacrifice for sins is left.
Thank you, David. If you would like a cassette tape of today's broadcast, you may request that by calling us at 1-877-9-INGETTI. That's a toll-free number. Or by writing us at Engedi Ministries, 165 Blair Road, Laverne, Tennessee, 37086. That address again is Engedi Ministries, 165 Blair Road, Laverne, Tennessee, 37086. This series is one in which all of the lessons are related and build toward a final goal, so if you've been unable to tune in each week and find that you have missed one or more of the lessons in this series, we offer them all as a complete set, and you may request that at the same address and phone number that I've given. Also, as part of our ministry, we offer a variety of taped presentations designed to help you in your own Bible study. A list of those resource tapes may be requested by calling us or by visiting our website at engedi.org. Thank you for being with us today, and may God richly bless you.